Vibhas, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Adam. Thanks for inviting me.
Of course. Well, I gotta say, from the first time I was exposed to Gallup, I there's some real brilliance to take very complicated concepts and distill them down to powerful thoughts. And Gallup has this ability to communicate in a way that's really powerful, and so do you. So for our audience, would you mind sharing what is your position within Gallup, and how does that really inform your perspective?
Sure. So I'm a senior practice expert with Gallup. I've been with the company now 20 years, and I've kind of lived and worked across 4 countries while with Gallup. So I've had a lot of global exposure. A lot of my work is in the area of leadership development and organizational development. So a lot of work around employee engagement, leadership development, and succession management. Those are the things that I typically do with a lot of my clients. And then I also lead Gallup's efforts around leadership research. So a lot of work around understanding leadership competencies and work around what it takes to be a successful leader.
The biggest challenge I'm going to have is to keep this conversation to 40, 45 minutes because we could go on for hours. I have so many questions for you. But where I'd like to begin, and I do with every episode, let's start at the CEO level. Yes, CEOs, all of them talk about the people matter. People are important. All of them talk about values. Most talk about purpose. But ultimately, what do they measure versus what they talk about? What are the goals that you hear leaders talk about in terms of what they measure?
Yeah, I think what many leaders care about and I think give much attention to is very clear. It's growth at the end of the day. Uh, there's, of course, much attention on capital expenditure, cost savings, technology spends, and so on. But I would say that while profit margins and productivity and those indicators are critical, specifically in this post-pandemic world, we might be overemphasizing these what I'd call lagging indicators. What leaders might not be focusing on so much, or what we call leading indicators. So there are things like employee engagement or customer engagement, or what Gallup would say are measures of employee thriving, employee well-being, and I'd also say an emotional connection to culture. And of course, these are kind of intangible and difficult to measure. But we've seen that these measures really predict future success, so future growth and revenue, and that's what keeps most CEOs up at night, right? And again, no leader will say that they don't care about employee well-being or engagement, but kind of the result speaks for themselves. So, I'll give you some numbers there. So, in the US, only about a third of employees are engaged at work, and that number has not materially changed for the last 10 years. In fact, after the pandemic, we are actually seeing a declining trend. So I want to make one point. Our CEO, John Clifton, recently wrote a book called Blind Spot. And according to John, one of the most significant indicators that CEOs and leaders have failed to see is the global rise of unhappiness. So these numbers have shot up from something like around 24% in 2006 to almost 33% in 2021. By the way, what I'm talking about is a representative poll of about 98% of the world's population. So we're talking about 5 million interviews. Now, as you look at that rise in global unhappiness, it's easy to blame the pandemic, but that increase in unhappiness predates the pandemic, and these are not black swan events. The pandemic was not a black swan event, and these disruptive changes we're seeing that CEOs need to take notice and take attention on, like things like workplace changes, employee burnout. These are not black swan events. So I'd say CEOs need to be able to kind of keep their pulse on what truly matters more to the emotional economy, and those metrics are the ones that drive the national economy. Everything like costs, profits, and productivity, and everything in between.
So much there. So lagging indicators, leading indicators. CEOs measure the lagging indicators because it's easier. It's probably also how their jobs are measured. And there's one study that shows that most CEOs are actually concerned about their own job's security. But you're saying it's time, and it's always been time. These issues have been present, you said, for 10 years. That we haven't made any progress in a positive direction. And in fact, you're saying a problem has been made worse as a result of the pandemic.
Yeah, and it's also inaction. A lot of companies do measure a lot. They have engagement surveys, they have brand surveys, they're looking at what their customers are saying and so on. But how much of that is being translated into action and decisions? Are the decisions being governed by more the rational economics, or decisions being driven by emotional economics and the upside that emotional economics represents?
I'm with you. Is it translating into action? And that would be my next question to you. I've been really challenged to think about who owns employee engagement in organizations. So I've talked to change management, I've talked to L&D, operation leaders, innovation, HR. I go suite to suite and I ask myself, you know, who should own the employee engagement? Who should own this emotional connection to the organization? What do you think?
That's a big question, and I think if you ask most organizations, they'll say yes, it's the leadership team, and everyone does. But if you really look at the practical application here, it's somebody in HR who's kind of spearheading the survey, and it's a pretty event-based programmatic approach to getting an engagement survey. But when you think about the indicator, I think some organizations think of employee engagement as kind of an overall measure or metric of organizational health. And in cases I've seen, it's kind of seen as an indicator of organizational culture. But at Gallup, we know that you probably have as many cultures as you have managers, right? Because there's tremendous range in engagement. There's tremendous variation. So we put this to the test in research we did because we wanted to understand if you want to think about who the owner is, let's try to find out what drives this variation. And we looked at multiple factors. We looked at gender, well, whether are you in the headquarters, are you in the regional office, how long you've been with the company, and so on. What we discovered is perhaps our single most, I'd say, significant discovery on workplace. A single individual, which is the manager, explains about 70% of the variance on employee engagement. So the most significant decision a CEO can make, or the most significant decision leaders can make, is whom you name as manager and whom you don't. That's the other point. So if leaders are really serious about engagement, then rather than kind of deputing HR to go fix my engagement problem, you have to start with equipping your managers to be better coaches, to help them provide better feedback, provide more consistent feedback, more continuous development feedback. I think that's important. So we kind of call this the boss to coach shift that is required, how you need to really make sure that managers are not acting like bosses, but more like coaches who are providing feedback, inspiration, and engagement on an ongoing basis. That actually makes a bigger difference than any programmatic once in a year survey does.
And it makes sense. You work with your manager. That's the person you look for to evaluate your progress. It's the person you look for recognition for many of the aspects in a workplace. And managers typically do not get promoted because they're amazing with people. Most managers get promoted because of their technical skills. So there has to be intentionality behind their organization in order to help evolve their managers. What are you seeing as best practices to prepare managers to undertake this aspect of the employee engagement journey, and what within it should managers focus on?
Yeah, you know what, we did a survey a while ago, and this was in India, and this was for software developers, and we were trying to understand how software developers, what their career path looks like, and so on. And what we found was interesting that the better you get at building, developing code, and doing great software, the less you get to do it because you're promoted to being a manager. So it's the Peter principle, right? You're promoted to higher degrees of incompetence. So when we talk to all these fantastic code developers and software engineers who are now managers about what they liked about their job, they said, actually, it's what I miss the most, which is developing great code. So I think that's important. Not everybody is cut out to be a great manager. So you not need to be able to understand what is talent, innate talent in being a great manager look like. So I think that's one. So I think managers again are critical to engagement. And yeah, another area that I think is often overlooked is company culture, and that's where we're seeing some massive problems. So recent research, and we've been continuously polling since the pandemic. Of course, we've been polling for a fairly long time, but almost at a quarterly level, we're actually coming out with some really interesting insights. So one of the big focus areas we put in our research was culture. And we asked employees, hey, do you feel a sense of emotional connection to the culture of the organization? And we found out that only 2 in 10 employees actually feel emotionally connected to culture. So I think the managers are important. But the other thing from an organizational point of view is that a lot of companies are feeling that their culture is drifting. A lot of that has to do with, as you know, working from home or in a kind of a flex hybrid setup. There's less connection to, culture's traditional ritualistic or kind of infrastructural components. So if companies have over-invested in setting up culture building as an activity or an event, then that's an issue. So besides managers, the other thing that we need to really focus on is kind of rebuilding culture, reimagining it, because your culture has evolved. It's in many ways it's drifted. So using the same paradigm of culture building in 2019 is not going to work because most of your employees, a big chunk of your employees are not walking into work and feeling and experiencing that culture.
Well, just think about that number. 2 out of 10 feel connect. 8 out of 10 do not feel an emotional connection to their organization. What does that mean? If I don't feel emotionally connected to the organization, how does that translate into my performance?
Disconnection to an extreme, I'd say. You've all heard about the quiet quitters. I mean, that's something that's taken up a lot of. We've been kind of reporting on the quiet quitter for a really long time. We call them not engaged. So these are the kind of employees who will walk into work, are perhaps disconnected with your culture. They'll do their bare minimum, but that's all they'll do. So I think that's one. We've seen that engagement connects directly to performance outcomes at the end of the day. So if you've got a lot of employees just coasting, it won't have an impact on performance outcomes and the kind of growth aspirations that you have. I think that disconnection is exacerbated by I think this kind of remote working and then move toward remote working. So like I said, I think that's what you almost need to audit your culture, if you know what I mean. It's like, hey, where is my culture today? And not have assumptions around your culture and the way it existed before, because the way you work has changed, and culture is the way you work. So re-looking at that is important.
You're so right. And as I'm thinking and experiencing the aspects of the virtual culture, it's really difficult and almost without being intentional. By default, the inertia of the experiences takes us toward just focusing on work and not the personal aspects. And, you get on the Zoom calls, right? And it's an hour, it's 45 minutes. You're done. There's a hi, how are you? How was your weekend? We're moving on. But in the office, those moments were, waiting for the meeting before, walking out together. How about we now get some water or get some coffee? Do you want to go for a walk? Do you want to do lunch? All of those is what built those emotional connections. All of those experiences is what created the bonds between individuals and their organization. And now they're gone. What do we do? What do you see great organizations do in terms of being really intentional about their culture with a focus on taking the virtual experiences and evolving them to be closer to those that were in person?
Yeah, I think the catch out of the bag. I think leaders want employees to walk back into the office, but they're not really truly understanding how needs have changed. So one of the things we talk about is you almost organizations need to create a workplace value proposition to get people to walk back in. And that needs to be a compelling value proposition. Why should I walk back in and what do I get? So our research suggests that it's actually things like collaboration. It's things like connection. These are the things that are required. So even though a lot of employees are kind of working hybrid now, there are opportunities when they do walk into work to maximize your culture, when they do walk into work to emphasize recognition, to emphasize collaboration, to conduct hackathons, to get people together. So I think maximizing the moments when people do walk in, that's more important rather than forcing people to walk in and stay in the office. I think that's what we are seeing.
Mm. So would you say this isn't going back to normal, that it's creating a new normal? In other ways, we're not expecting this to be a 9 to 5 back to the office for those that have that choice. Are we looking for this to be a, a couple times a week? It's now intentional. You're coming back in for collaboration, that you're coming back for connection, team building. How do you see it?
This is the new normal. This is the next normal. I'll give you some numbers there on hybrid research, which are interesting. So we're seeing that our latest research, this is actually Q2 of 2022, we're showing that about 6 in 10 employees prefer hybrid working. That's a very large number if you think about it. About 3 in 10 want to be exclusively remote, and less than 1 in 10 would actually like to be on site. That's the preference. In terms of who is currently working hybrid, about 5 in 10. So hybrid is the way. And when you kind of think about what are the advantages of hybrid, so we did a survey where we asked hybrid workers, what are the advantages of working in this way? And better work-life balance, more efficient use of the time you have, freedom, lesser burnout, all that is good. But they also kind of admitted that they feel less connected to the culture of the company. So it comes at a cost overall. And collaboration and relationship building, that's also impaired. So like I mentioned, what companies need to do is build a new workplace value proposition, not force people to walk in, because productivity does suffer. A lot of hybrid working population is saying that they're more productive when they're working hybrid, and then maximize the time when employees are kind of on site. Another big strategy that companies are using is individualization, which means that employees working from home have different needs. And rather than force fitting a management style, you kind of start with listening to what employees want, adjusting as a manager a management style to what they want, what their needs are, what their strengths are, what their goals are, because they'll enable to deliver their best performance, right? Irrespective of work schedule or where they work. Individualization is incredibly important.
It makes a ton of sense. And I've had a lot of conversations recently where I hear organization executives are very linear, back to office. We got to get work done. And then there's a disconnect, or on the opposite extreme are the associates within the organization saying, no, 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 hold on a second, especially for those where, let's say there isn't a lot of collaboration or teamwork by design of what they do. You're now adding tremendous commute pressure, less time with the family without there being a reason. And you're saying it's about individualizing, it's about understanding the needs of that person and then making sure that you are meeting them where they are while understanding the needs of the organization. Is that right?
That's absolutely right. And that does require conversations. That requires constant connection. So sometimes, when you are hybrid, your kind of managers might forget or not have an intentional, consistent focus on dialogue and conversation. What I mean by that is not just daily work, actually having a connection, a conversation, asking questions like, do you know what's expected of you? What do you value the most? Tell me about a project you've done recently. How can I help you? you know, those individualized personal conversations, regular check-ins, even though that you're remote, those are incredibly important.
And let's talk about this idea of a connection, very specifically between a manager and associate. And a connection doesn't, in my view, it doesn't mean time together. Although that's a factor of it, but you could be on the phone with someone for 10, 15 minutes and you may not improve the connection. You may be robotic, you may be distracted, you're not authentic, you're not real. You could still be asking some questions, what project did you work on, but you don't show that you really care. I think a connection is when you're present, when you're authentic, and when you show that you care for the person on the other side. Where does your research and your travels, where does it take you in terms of how to build a connection that's real?
Yeah, for one, I'm going back to what I said earlier. Not everybody is cut out to be a manager. So if you're not cut out to be a manager, you're likely to use the conventional, traditional command and control kind of way of working. But I think what I've seen great managers do differently is ask great questions. And these questions are focused and targeted at the individual. Now, at Gallup, we have this thing called Clifton Strengths, which kind of gives you a fairly good idea. It's a psychometric assessment in a survey that you take, and it tells you what your top five strengths are. So, for example, my number one theme is ideation. My number two theme is strategic. Now, if you want to have an individualized conversation as a manager with an employee, that's fantastic information because you're saying, hey, I'm going to ask questions that are individualized to this person. And I'm going to give him opportunities that help him maximize the strengths that he already has. At the same time, you might have certain non-talents, and I'm going to help them with that. So, for instance, my number 34 theme is discipline. So, obviously, having a manager who doesn't kind of say, "Hey, I want you to be disciplined, and I'll send you to discipline school, and got to do this and so on." To say, "Hey, how can I help you with that? Can I get you a partner? Is there a system you can use, and so on?" So, this strengths-based management style, that highly individualized management style. That's what great managers do exceptionally well. Because the conversation is focused not on what I want you to do, but it's how can I enable you to shine every day. There's a huge difference between, like I said, the boss to coach shift is the point we are trying to make is a strengths based shift.
The day where Dr. Clifton came up multiple times, I actually just spoke to our friends at BI Worldwide, and the gentleman there, Mark, he used to work with Dr. Clifton. And similar to myself, once I was exposed to the idea of strength-based, and I took the test, and I have an activator as one of my profiles, or one of my strengths, I couldn't look back. And I kept wondering, why isn't this the norm in organizations? And hearing you talk about it now in the context of connection, it's almost saying, look, if you're a manager that really cares, then you take the time to understand. Once you take the time to understand, then you customize your conversations, you tailor your approach. It's no longer about you, it's about the person you're talking to. How do you show up and meet them where they are? How do you help them focus on their strength? How do you take responsibility for their journey, and dare I say, responsibility for helping them unlock their potential in their career?
Yeah. No, strengths for us at Gallup, it's a revolution. We're on a mission. We got about more than 28 million people who've taken strengths, and I think our estimates is that every day somebody takes about 6,500 people actually take the strengths. That's the mission we're on because we want the world to know their strengths. Wouldn't that be a much better life for everyone where you're actually focusing and playing to your strengths? But I think a lot of organizations focus there is in the deficit-based approach. Like, let's focus on what's wrong with you rather than what's right with you. And it does take a lot of time to shift that mindset because that's what people have grown up with all these years. Most traditional management will tell you that you need to review, what are the weaknesses of an individual. And Dr. Clifton's big shift was positive psychology. It's what's right with you. Let's start there. That can and then find that and then amplify it. Provide more opportunities for people to live their strengths every day.
That was a paradigm shift in my career. I think it was about 6 or 7 years ago. I was exposed to positive psychology, and my career took a turn. What is in your experience when you have executives that they're not bought in on strength based executives, like you said, that grew up in, like I've seen a lot in my first career, investment banking. There's no chance the folks that I used to work with are going to be interested in strength based. Well, maybe today. I hope they've changed, but at that time, certainly they wouldn't be interested. When executives are not sold on that idea, do you see them being able to change over time? Is there a moment where they look at the case study, use case, or is it about the next generation of executives coming in that would get it?
It's the first step is really for them to generate a sense of self-awareness themselves. So when I've worked with CEOs and I'm an executive coach, so I work with leaders, is when they get to know what their strengths are. They might not immediately agree with those, but as I work with them, as some of our coaches work with executive leaders, it is incredible how quick that shift happens in terms of, yes, I do see it. Because the point about strengths is that even strengths they have a dark side and they have a light side. So overuse of strength can also be injurious to who you are as a leader. So if I have high achiever, I'm highly focused, but I might be leaving dead bodies in my stride. So I think when leaders start understanding and getting feedback and sharing their strengths with their peers and with their direct reports and get great feedback, get great positive feedback, reinforcement, as well as very direct, honest, brutally honest feedback, I think the shift happens then. Otherwise, it'll never happen because it'll always be going back to the traditional mode of saying, "Hey, let's focus on what's wrong."
Become the change that you want to see in the world, right? If an executive says it's not for us, it's for them, that is not going to be the beginning of a change that will take hold. What I'm curious about next is, back to the manager, right? And the book, Gallup's book about the manager. And I think you and I even mentioned a few times, hey, it's all about the manager, stupid. Not saying someone is stupid, but fundamentally we must focus on the managers. But we also must be empathetic. The managers have a lot on their plates, whether you call them the frozen middle, whether you talk about how much pressure they have being in between. And here we're adding more onto their plates. That's not performance. That's not core to their business as they see it. But all of a sudden we're talking about keeping in mind the strength of their associates, having more conversations. They're responsible for the connection. I want to talk about the future of people initiatives. What do you What do you see in the future state? How would you dream about the future? And I think you and I would agree that technology would be part of the solution. But what do you think is the future of how we enable managers to do better in this aspect? As a case in point of improving the connections that they have with their direct reports as well as the reports to the organization.
Yeah, I really think the future is more human than it is technological. I mean, I wrote an article about this called augmented leadership, and you can think about augmented reality and the metaverse and so on. And what about augmented humanity? How are we not going to replace managers and leaders with a bunch of code? So I think the importance of the managers and leaders in driving emotional connections, the 70% of decision making is emotional. That I think is still going to be important. But this is also where we have the biggest challenge because our latest research, again from Q2 this year, shows that about 47% of leaders are engaged. That number for managers is 34%. So leaders are engaged, not necessarily managers. Managers are almost at the same level of engagement as compared to individual contributors. And amongst those managers, the managers that are struggling the most are hybrid managers. So think about that. Hybrid managers is a very different, kettle of fish there, and there's a lot that leaders can do to help these managers. So you mentioned that, and that's right. One of the biggest challenges we've seen managers face is competing priorities. Now, you couple that with increasing workload, couple that with the challenge of managing and coordinating across multiple sites. Like you're a hybrid manager, you're managing somebody else who's hybrid, somebody else who's on site, who's remote, somebody who's in a different time zone. That has put tremendous amounts of load on hybrid managers and tremendous amount of burnout. So when you think about engagement and burnout, hybrid managers have the lowest levels of both. So I think what leaders can do is simplify their lives. Um, of course, select the right kind of people for those positions. I talked about that as well. But provide good feedback and coaching. Um, Take something off their plate before adding something more. So leaders can actually simplify strategy and how that translates into tactics. That'll help managers immensely. And then just really investing in their development, investing in their ability, like I said, to become a better coach and not just kind of pushing them up the career ladder, to higher levels without equipping them with the right kind of management skills. So I think that's going to be very important. That's the role of leadership, I think.
Couldn't agree more. I'm curious to hear more about the augmented leadership. I think there's a lot of concern about technology coming into our lives, and it's almost like you're saying technology can help us be more human and help leaders become more human. How do you see that future?
Yeah, I think technology is an enabler. It's not something that'll replace what we do. In fact, it'll free us up to do more of this emotional connection in the future. Technology and augmented leadership, if you may, and that's already happening. You look at the metaverse and Microsoft HoloLens and all that great gizmos. I think they cannot replace that emotional connection between an individual and a person that they're managing. What it can do, and where technology needs to be used in the right way, is to simplify, is to automate, and then free up time to actually do more of coaching, working with each other, thinking about breakthrough ideas, innovating, brainstorming. So I think all those will be helped by the advent of technology. But wherever we see, hey, technology can replace the human connection, I'd be very wary of that.
Well, the moment that technology can replace a human connection, I think the least of our concerns is going to be what happens between a manager and a direct report. I think at that point, our entire society is going to face an entirely new set of challenges, which could be its own podcast. I think you would agree.
No, and that's why leaders need to prioritize investments. I'm not saying they don't need to prioritize technology in the way it enables our people, our customers, our suppliers. I mean, all of that is good, but prioritize the emotional economy. Prioritize in investments which create well-being, that create thriving for not just our employees but also our customers. So I think that's the big difference, that big shift that leaders need to make in their thinking.
And going back to leadership, and you said it's from a manager to a coach, right? What are some of the most distinct characteristics that define someone from being a manager or moving from being a manager to becoming a coach?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things that we found to be extremely important. And a big part of that, I think I already mentioned, is the ability to ask great questions and the ability to listen. So I think that the traditional mold is kind of unclear and misaligned expectations, right? You're kind of saying, hey, here's what I need you to do, but not really establishing expectations really well, sharing expectations. I think that we found that to be a big one. The other one is the traditional boss is more ineffective and infrequent feedback, but the coach is really the continual coaching and ongoing conversation. So at Gallup, we talk about 5 conversations rather than 1 or 2. There's one conversation that you have at the beginning of the year. There's one that you do at the end of the year. But there are other conversations you can do in the middle of the year. Development focused conversations, quick check ins. We've seen managers do that exceptionally well. And I always say this, if you think about an average manager having 5 direct reports, if you were able to spend maybe an hour per direct report per quarter, having a conversation about the individual, not about your work, but about them, that's 5 hours a quarter. That's not a lot of investment that can create a fantastic impact on engagement, performance, and productivity. So I think that's one. And then obviously create accountability around it and so on. But that's the difference that great managers make.
So sounds that's excellent. That's not a lot of time. It's all about being intentional with the time that you do have and understanding that the impact it's going to create is going to be profound. It'll improve retention, but also going back to where we started this conversation, it's going to have an impact on every lagging indicator that you're tracking as an organization.
That's correct. The 70% drives the 30%. The 70% emotional drives the 30%. And leaders must understand that.
Yeah. So, just kind of thinking about what's next, the folks that are listening to this podcast, these are not the naysayers or the skeptics at the executive level. These are champions inside their organization. So imagine a champion, a profile of someone that could be in L&D, change management, maybe they're an operations leader. They truly believe strength-based approach works. They truly want to help elevate their managers to become coaches, to focus on building a connection, on the connection with their organization. How do they begin? What do you see as the most successful path to gain internal alignment for champions to affect this type of change?
Yeah, I think it really does need to start with leaders and I'd say leadership alignment at the top, because I think why leaders want to focus and invest in the rational element is because they find a sense of comfort there, a sense of predictability, and emotions are messy and complex and difficult to deal with. So aligning on that, before I work with any organization around a large scale change or transformation efforts, I always want the leaders to come together and be aligned on things like priorities and decisions and their unique strengths and their collective strengths and so on. So I think starting with leaders and getting leaders to experience this, the power of emotional economics, firsthand, I think that's the first one you need to do. You also do need to make a business case for it. So it's not just a fuzzy HR initiative, but it has real teeth. Gallup research has shown that if you actually do focus on strengths, on engagement, there's a massive impact on any imaginable business outcome you can think of, whether it's turnover, profitability, productivity, customer metrics, and so on. So, and leaders need to see the business case, like they would want to see the business case in any other rational investment they make. There is a business case for these emotional metrics as well. So I think that would be my first bit of advice. The other is, which is kind of a mantra for me, I always say it's culture before structure. So, if you want to bring about structural change, you first need to start with building cultural resiliency and drive cultural change, because without culture, your structure is bound to fail. So don't go straight to, hey, let's put this program in place and let's put this initiative in place. First, understand the capacity of your culture to be able to do this effectively. So whether it's a strengths-based or an engagement, whatever you're trying to do, don't go straight to program. Go to understand first what your culture looks like. And again, I want to reinforce the importance of the manager and gaining buy-in from these managers. And leaders must engage these managers kind of early on the journey as co-participants and not as just recipients of change, if you may. So I think that's the key. Get your leaders aligned, think through the culture, understand where you are, and then get managers to join you on that journey of change.
Get them to join you, and within those managers, there's probably going to be, as any other adoption, there's going to be the early adapters. There'll be those that are really excited. There are going to be some that are in between, and then there are going to be some that are either trailing change or maybe will not align to where the organization is headed. Do you see some of those difficult conversations come up in companies as they go through this journey?
Absolutely. So we think that if you want to really think about true managers, great managers, and if you think about those who have an innate talent for being a great manager, our estimate is about 1 in 10. I know it's very less. 2 in 10 have kind of conditional talent, and can do the job. The rest really need a lot of help. They need coaching, they need feedback. So you're right. So the early adopters are the one who get it. They're the first one to say, yes, this makes sense. Being a coach makes sense. And they're already doing it. That's the other thing. If you look in your organizations, you'll see actually there are some who are already doing it. Why not kind of use those and showcase those as, I hate to use the word best practices, but it's kind of like, here's an example of a manager who is already doing all of this, and then kind of exemplify that. I'd say there is already a lot of great engagement in most organizations. It just is waiting to be found.
Yeah, shine the spotlight on where it works, scale that, make sure to keep being intentional and thinking about kind of the future-proofing the organization. I have so many more questions, but looking at time, I just want to pause here with one last question for you before I let you go, and I very much appreciate your time. But as you think about where the organizations are headed in the future, and we know a lot of challenges, in some ways unprecedented, although we have talked about some of the data has stayed pretty steady. What are you most excited about as you think about the future of organizations?
I'm most excited about the ability of organizations to identify talent and to be able to put that talent in the right place and in front of our best and biggest opportunities to drive change. And when I say that, I mean to create a change and almost a shift in the human condition. Because I think more of it as the organization's commitment and responsibility to driving larger organizational sustainable change, if you know what I mean. I mean, if you think about what the pandemic has done, it's brought out the most predictably irrational part of us, in many ways. And I think our biggest impact is going to be providing people with opportunities so that they can be their best and drive impact, not just in the work they're doing, but do something that takes our humanity a few steps forward rather than many steps back. Because it is about understanding and realizing human behavior in all its glory and in all its pain. I know it might seem a little intangible, but I think we can have leaders make that difference with people and their well-being and their engagement. And yes, we can change the world.
Few steps forward to change the world. What a thought to leave our conversation on. This has been incredible. Thank you for taking the time. I can't wait to bring you back on again.
It's a pleasure, Adam. Thank you very much for having me.
Over and out.